It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I hope you can make out my Canadian accent. It's not British, it's not American, but I hope it's reasonably clear. I'll try to talk over the arrow shows and planes and so on. So what I want to do today is I want to try to reconstruct and present an argument that faith provides a central, if not essential, element in the promotion of peace. And here I draw principally on some of the insights and arguments provided by the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. And Maritain, I think, is very interesting because he was a major figure in political philosophy in the 20th century. He was also a key influencer in the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. Now, Maritain's account of the conditions for peace are rooted in his personalist humanism and his understanding of the human person. So in the first section of my presentation, what I want to do is provide a brief summary of his humanism. And I think what we find here is that humanism requires both a commitment to reason and an acknowledgement of faith. I then turn to Maritain's essay, The Spiritual Conditions for Progress and Peace. It's an essay he wrote in 1966 towards the end of his life. Maritain argues that it is important, first, to distinguish two different conceptions of peace, but also, second, to realize that all conflict is fundamentally a disorder, not an institutional or political disorder, but a disorder in the human person. So building on this background, I want to present Maritain's argument that while philosophy and reason are essential to building peace, these are not sufficient by themselves. What is required is love, a change of heart, and a recasting of reason. And these are not possible, Maritain claims, without some appeal to faith, whether it be a faith in humanity, or as Maritain himself argues, a love that has its root ultimately in one's relation to the divine. So first, let me take some time to talk about Maritain and humanism. Maritain's focus on the human person appears from very early on in his career, and it goes throughout his writings. You find it in his 1921 essay on Christian humanism, in his 1927 essay on the primacy of the spiritual, in lectures on the degrees of knowledge, and finally, I think, importantly, in lectures from 1934 that became the basis for his book, Humanisme Intégral, or Integral Humanism. For example, in this very early essay from 1921, Maritain speaks of the promise of a Christian humanism made new. And in this early essay, the notion of Christian humanism is still undeveloped. Maritain became a Catholic only in about 1908, but this attests to Maritain's effort to take on the humanism of his day. And what he suggests is that the humanism of his day falls short of a full understanding of the human being. Now, Maritain sees in the humanism of his day a kind of reversion to classical Greek philosophy, and the idea that humanism is the attainment of intellectual perfection in speculation and in the arts, but in the end, that effort after perfection is very temporary and very episodic. And when it comes to the moral order, it's very often incomplete. And even though there was a turn towards a Christian humanism in the Middle Ages, later centuries, during the period of the Renaissance and the Reform, returned to that kind of secular humanism from the Greek period. Maritain suggests that a purely naturalistic account of human nature is incomplete, and that attention needs to be paid to the spiritual and to the aspiration or inclination for immortality. So while this humanism is properly a matter of philosophy, Maritain recognizes that the insights of religion and faith are necessary for a full account of a properly human life. Now, this interest in the person also appears in a number of other texts. I'm not going to go into them right now, but what is interesting is that even when he's not talking about something that directs itself specifically to, let's say, the political or to the social or to the aesthetic, he keeps on reminding us of the importance of a supernatural love for one's neighbor and even for one enemy. He also refers to the person as destined for immortality, and that the end function of the state requires the protection of human personality. Now, if you're going to ask what is meant by this idea of human personality, in a way it's something that is rooted in his own understanding of what it is to be human. So his emphasis on such a new or integral humanism, and especially on the human person, rests on how he understands what it is to be a human being. At the most basic level, the human person is defined as a body and soul. And I should say here by soul, I'm not talking about something that is religious, I'm talking about something that is metaphysical. So, body and soul are a unity of soul and flesh. That is, that the human being has a material and a spiritual character, and that both must be recognized to understand the person. What is meant specifically by the spiritual character is left undefined in his early work, but body and soul lie at the basis for a distinction between individuals and persons. Because Maritain says that the human being is a being that is both an individual and a person. Now, on the one hand, the human being is an individual specimen of a species. You could call this a biological category. Moreover, human beings are naturally social, and they are parts or members of a social whole, of a political community. And that political community has as its end a common good. But this is an ontological category. It's not just a social category. It's what it is to be a human being, has this social dimension. Maritain notes, citing St. Thomas, that every single person is, in regard to the community, as a part in relation to a whole, and is therefore subordinate to the whole. And as a temporal or material being, and as an individual, the human being, therefore, has as its end or purpose this social whole. But the political community is also a community of persons, and this common temporal good is the common good of human persons. So, for example, Maritain writes that in subordinating himself to the common task, the human person is subordinate to the accomplishment of the personal life of others, of other persons. And as a member of the social body, that is the body of individuals who are also persons, the human being has needs of constraints of social life to be led to and sustained in his own life as a person. And reciprocally, he must provide the appropriate relations and constraints on others to help others develop their personality as well. So we can be what we are fully, and we can come to know what we are and who we are only in common with other persons. Maritain knows that it's not just a matter of mutual dependence that brings society together, nor even just a desire for a common good. What brings human beings together is that they are persons. Yet for Maritain, there is more to the human being than its relationship to temporal society. He writes that the human person is a spiritual being, made in the image of God. A person is spiritually subsistent, and not just a part, although human beings are a part, but they are also a whole. Maritain adds that as the spiritual substance, the human person has a vocation for spiritual accomplishment and the conquest of true freedom. Thus, Maritain speaks about the supra-temporal ends of the human person. So not just the temporal, but the supra-temporal ends of the human person. From this account of the human being, we can see what Maritain means by his new or integral humanism. And since the objective of this humanism is to make human beings more human, this new humanism means the realization of human beings as individuals and as persons, who have both a temporal common good and a supra-temporal common good. This humanism is therefore also a personalism. So humanism and personalism imply one another, and both are necessary for the new world that Maritain thinks has to be constructed. And so remember, Maritain is writing this at a time after the First World War, during the period before the Second World War, but also even during the Second World War, sort of thinking about all these times of conflict, and what is it that has to be respected, and what is it that has to be valued. So this personalism also exhibits the importance of a connection with other persons, with other human persons, but also with the divine person. One finds three key features in Maritain's account of the person. First, love is a key feature. Maritain adds that this orientation in the spiritual order involves a concern for other persons, a love for other persons, and an evangelical concern for humanity. Indeed, to become incarnate, to become manifest, this love must permeate the social order and the structures of common life. Maritain writes that we are born to tend to this perfection of a love which really and universally surrounds mankind, which leaves no space for hatred towards anyone, and which really transforms our being. Second, this perfection of love involves faith. For the love that transforms one's being can't simply be a product of social technique or a system of education or re-education, but can only be a product of the creator of our being. Thus Maritain writes of the need to love in man what in man enlivens man, vivifies man, love itself and the Spirit's gift of love. The human person, this material being with temporal ends, then is called to a transcendent end and to a relation with the divine person. That is, the human person seeks faith, naturally seeks faith, and the divine person responds through, for example, the infused virtue of faith. Now, I think it's important to understand what Maritain means by faith. And when many people speak about faith today, there's often a misunderstanding. For many, faith is just belief. It's not knowledge, it's something that you happen to feel, you happen to believe. And belief suggests that you don't really know something. It's something about which you cannot be certain. Now, when Maritain refers to faith, he refers to it sometimes talking about the Christian faith, sometimes talking about articles of faith like dogmas or individual religious beliefs. But really, what is it that faith is itself? And in this early work, Theonas, from 1921, he presents a very standard definition of faith. He says, faith is the principle and root of all the supernatural virtues, giving to our intellect the power to see as if it were through the eye of God. So faith provides us with this extra capacity. However, Maritain acknowledges that there are two very distinct conceptions of faith. He writes first of a faith which believes but does not see. He calls it a deaf and merely mechanical faith. And he uses the example of merely accepting what the church teaches, what St. John Henry Newman might have called a notional assent. But Maritain also notes a different sense, a communion with the infinitely luminous knowledge of God, concerned with what is revealed, not with systems of thought. And by communion here, Maritain does not mean just a kind of trust, but that on which trust is based, a relation with a person, that is to say, a relation with God. Maritain explains the difference by noting how the intellect is involved in these two different conceptions of faith. In the former sense, that kind of deaf sense, the intellect employs a way of thinking that is rooted in the sciences, what Maritain calls the physico-mathematical sciences, and it focuses on symbols and signs and on information which can be of use to us. One's intellect extracts from faith just what is of practical use. But this way of functioning of the intellect then just stops, deals with what is useful, but it stops short of being, it stops short of truth, which is the actual object of faith. Taking this first way of intellectually appropriating faith actually crystallizes it. It sort of solidifies it in a non-dynamic way. But it avoids a real and personal engagement with its object, and may even empty true faith of its content. So by way of illustration, Maritain sees this physico-mathematical approach to faith as reflecting something where we listen to the testimony of others, but we let the other's testimony be the source of our faith. And what we don't do is we don't actually engage it ourselves. We don't testify to it ourselves. We don't build our own faith ourselves. He calls this intellectualization of faith a kind of intellectual opportunism. He says people who have faith in this first sense have every intention of using the information to get to heaven, but they have never been face to face with the reality of the mystery of the incarnation, with the mystery of the redemption, with the sufferings of the Savior. They have never experienced the shock of recognition of faith. The scales have not fallen from their eyes. Now, Maritain's point is not to challenge an intellectual approach to faith, but to argue that by adopting this kind of rationalist or physical mathematical approach to faith is unsuited to its object, that it may affect faith as to the conditions under which it is exercised, and that therefore the intellect has to be restored to its natural and deep-rooted functioning. Maritain says that faith in the second sense seeks an engagement with its object. It seeks to see. It is because faith comes from God and not from natural reason that it is not just known, but it is a certitude. It has as its object truth. It doesn't focus on formulas or signs or rituals one needs to make a transition to the reality signified. Moreover, although the one who has faith draws on testimony, draws on the testimony of Scripture, of the witnesses of the saints, and so on, he must himself take the responsibility for belief and himself vouch for its veracity, as though he had seen it himself. And when I say he, of course, I mean she. You know, there are many women here, so don't forget that. But he's writing in a different age. Thus, it reflects a personal commitment, what Newman would call a real assent. As Newman would say, real assents form the mind. They have a central effect on behavior. It is dispositional and perhaps even foundational. And it is the source of love and the source of the will to risk for the sake of that love. Now, there's another point to add about this second sense of faith, of a communion with this infinitely luminous knowledge of God. As infused faith, then, is the product of a relation, what Maritain calls a relation of person to person. So that's what faith is. It's not a kind of an object, it's a relation of persons to persons. In particular, of the divine person to the human, of the human to the divine, and its efficacy is to create unity of persons, a unity of spirit. It is not to create doctrine, although reflection on this relation naturally leads to doctrine, and it requires a certain attitude to truth, wisdom, and freedom. Now, the third key feature of Maritain's personalist humanism is that such a humanism requires a substantial transformation. Not simply the inauguration of new social structures, but Maritain says also a rousing of forces of faith, of intelligence and love in the inner depths of the soul, an advance in the discovery of the world of spiritual realities. Only on these conditions, he writes, can the human being truly enter profoundly into the deep planes, the deep levels of his nature, without mutilating or disfiguring it. And normally I would say a little bit more about the issue of reason here, but I'm just going to move on a bit about that. There are, Maritain would add, following St. Thomas, though, limits to reason. It is not just that some possible objects of knowledge are not suited to human reason, for example, the objects of mystical experience or mystical contemplation, is that some of the powers of reason are wounded by original sin. In an essay entitled Reflections on Wounded Nature, Maritain writes, to the extent that it suffers from this wound, reason is deprived of being ordered to the true in respect to speculative judgment itself, at least when it is a question of attaining the highest and most difficult truths. In short, then, Maritain's distinctive humanism is an integral humanism. He calls it integral humanism because, in part, human beings are viewed as wholes, but also because there is a rehabilitation of the creature, in God. And so it's this more robust sense of what it is to be a human being that founds this integral humanism, unlike earlier secular or earlier Greek humanisms. Achieving or realizing this integral humanism then requires love, faith, and intelligence. Now, obviously, reason has a role in the transformation called for by this integral humanism, because he says it is faith, intelligence, and love. And throughout history, there have been rationalist attempts at establishing new cultures and building new communities. But reason by itself is insufficient, and there needs to be, so to speak, an integration of faith and reason in the person. And if religion is excluded or ignored, then one has a defective understanding, not only of the human person, but of reality. And the transformation that Maritain describes, therefore, also needs love. And love is a relation. So a relation to and of other persons, human and divine, and the source of that love is faith. So Maritain's view is that reason and faith in God, and an awareness of our end as spiritual beings, are what is needed to provide a genuine personalist humanism and to create a humanist culture. For the Christian, one's aspiration to faith and one's natural capacity to reason are both part of what it is to be a human person. And Maritain would say that even for the non-Christian, both faith and reason are present. That there is a recognition of faith, if only in a kind of secondary sense, as a faith in humanity, which animates the desire or love for others. And Maritain is writing some of this in the 1930s, and he says even the fascists and even the communists of the 1930s, in a way, claim a kind of faith, because they claim for their temporal community, their fascist or communist paradise, the love for which the kingdom of God should be loved. So even there's a kind of secondary kind of faith that's involved here. Now, how does this bear on the present discussion of the conditions for peace for today? And so to help with this, I want to turn very briefly to Maritain's 1966 essay, The Spiritual Conditions for Progress and Peace. Then, as now, peace is a problem and peace is a challenge. Maritain's discussion of the role of the spiritual with regard to peace brings together the philosophical and the religious, the spiritual and things of this world. Now, peace can be understood in different ways. And Maritain contrasts, on the one hand, peace, which is understood as a situation that is free from conflict. So you think of Ukraine, or you think of a place, perhaps in the Middle East where there's conflict. And you say peace means an end to that conflict. But he says, that's just one sense of peace. We can contrast that sense of peace with peace as the removal of a disposition to conflict, a disposition to disorder, which focuses on something about the human person. It is this latter sense of peace that is, he says, the more fundamental. And this is what Maritain associates with reconciliation, mutual love, and fraternity. Maritain recognizes the challenges of achieving peace. In this essay, though, he says that conflict is not a technical problem to be solved. That while conflict is a temporal matter and requires action in the world, peace, the disposition to peace, requires something more. Why? Because the temporal is dependent on the spiritual. And that's why the title of this essay is on the role of the spiritual. The role of the spiritual is to offer inspiration. And this inspiration informs education, cultural renewal, and the mobilization of intelligence. This is nothing new, he thinks, and it's not even distinctive of Christian. In his 1927 volume, The Things Which Are Not Caesar's, he says, for example, take the example of the Indian Gandhi. There, in 1927, you see Gandhi, who is involved and motivated by the primacy of the spiritual. Gandhi challenges the British in India by fasting, by penances, by suffering deliberately chosen. In order to achieve peace, it is the spiritual impulse that is key and foundational. So it's not just a Christian phenomenon here. What is the spiritual impulse? For insight into this, Maritain turns to the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, in particular the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, whose final chapter is the fostering of peace and the promotion of a community of nations. What Gaudium et Spes seeks to provide or offer is an awakening and a reorientation of our priorities. Reason has a role. Faith is not sufficient for this renewal, and the spiritual impulse must be completed by a philosophy and a theology, because the concrete conditions of peace are a matter of experience. The achievement of peace requires a vast work of reason, he writes. No inspiration truly inspires man if it does not come down to the point where the intellect and the senses wrestle with it, and with the multiplicity of questions posed by existence. But reason is insufficient. Remember, Maritain writes that reason is wounded. It suffers a privation, and so far as it is wounded, it is deprived of its being ordered to the true, even in speculative matters. So while peace is reasonable, it will not be reason alone that leads people to a disposition of peace. This requires something more. This is what the work of the Spirit provides. In Gaudium et Spes, it says that we need first the recognition of a spiritual impulse, and then the teaching to apply it in a way that forces us to recast, to reorient our entire way of thinking. He talks about it bringing about a revolution in our way of thinking. So this is intelligence. So faith requires reorientation of intelligence. Maritain speaks of a refocusing of priorities, about a focus on dignity. Indeed, our consciousness of human dignity requires such an enlightened reason. Second, Maritain says that this requires a change of heart. What it requires is an awakening of a concern for the good and for the common good. It requires a focus on justice. It requires a commitment, a disposition to be just. But it also requires love, because he says peace is the work of love. Peace will also require some faith and hope, a hope that is itself not the product of reason. And hope for this change, while not unreasonable, is rooted in faith. Maritain says that there's an awakening of a life of contemplative prayer and union with God, from which love flows. Love flows from prayer and union with God. And this supports the work of human beings. Love, agape, is related to God, to religion, to faith, reflecting a relation of person to person. So it's the relation to God. So the center of his argument for peace is love. And this love comes from or from one's relation to God. The fruit of love, Maritain writes, is an awakening of a real concern for the common good. It is also a rational good, but it involves an awakening of that life through contemplative prayer. Thus, the conditions for peace are both rational and spiritual. But this turn to love and faith is not appealing to something from outside, a kind of solution ex machina. It is a solution that takes place in persons. The person as a material and a spiritual being, a being that is involved in this world, but who is related to something outside this world. So in conclusion, what Maritain offers is an alternative to individualist and collectivist understandings of the human person. And he insists that we need a new humanism, a personalist humanism. One insight that Maritain provides is to look at what it is to be a person and to see how the desire for faith, meaning, and value, and the capacity for reason arise in the whole, or the unity that is the person. It is only if we understand this insight into the person that one can get people to care for others, to risk for others, to seek to bring order to what is disordered in themselves, and to work for peace. Thank you.